Hi everyone, welcome back to the Grape Explorer. In this series of videos, we are taking a walkthrough of WSET Level 2. This is part 2, so don't forget to check out other videos in this series. If you're new to this channel, welcome. I'm the Grape Explorer. On this channel, I do wine education, product reviews, and lots of wine tastings. So if you're interested in wine, consider subscribing. Part 2 in this series is all about learning outcome 2, and that is helping you to understand how winemaking and bottle aging influence the style and quality of wine. Of all the learning outcomes for WSET Level 2, this one actually has the fewest assessment criteria to it, with just 4 individual assessment criteria. And they are being able to state the key stages of alcoholic fermentation processes, being able to identify the key stages of the winemaking processes used for red, rosé and white wines, being able to describe how winemaking options can influence the style and quality of wine produced, as well as being able to identify the key changes that occur to a wine during bottle aging. The format of these videos is as follows. I will go through each of the assessment criteria and then give you some example questions to get you familiar with the style and approach that WSET take when it comes to that all-important exam. So let's jump straight into assessment criteria 1 and look at those key stages of the alcohol fermentation process. Now, quite simply, the fermentation process is the converting of sugars into alcohols and carbon dioxide with the introduction of yeasts. Those yeasts can either be naturally present in the grapes themselves, or a winemaker may choose to introduce a cultured yeast into that grape juice to convert the sugars into alcohol. When it comes to the types of questions you might expect to get here, actually the assessment criteria itself is pretty straightforward. So I've only given a couple of simple examples just to get you familiar with the styles of question you might get. So the process of converting sugars into alcohol is known as what? Maturation, fermentation, barrel aging, or crushing. Now obviously this is quite a simple example, but this is all about helping you understand the structure of questions that you get asked. Multiple choice questions, or on occasion, true or false questions. And of course the answer in the case of this one is fermentation. But there's also the question here, fermentation converts sugar into alcohol and what else? Is it oxygen, sulfur dioxide, carbon dioxide, or hydrogen? And again, you'll learn that the fermentation process is getting those yeasts to convert the sugars into alcohol and into carbon dioxide. So with that rather simple assessment criteria covered off, let's move on to assessment criteria number 2. And that's where you're going to start to identify the key stages of the winemaking processes used for red, rosé and white wines. And the stages you're going to cover in more detail are going to be things that are happening once those grapes have been harvested and been brought to the winery. So we're thinking about things like the crushing of the grapes, the fermentation that we just covered, the pressing of the grapes for certain styles of wine, the storage and or maturation of that wine following fermentation, and here I'm thinking about something like barrel aging, as well as certain processes like blending and ultimately the final packaging of that wine into bottles. And so what you'll learn as part of this course are the different processes for red, for white and for rosé. And I've come up with an example here of the white wine making process for our next question. So put the following in order for white wine production. 1 maturation, 2 crushing, 3 fermentation or 4 pressing. And do we think that that happens in the following orders? Is it 4, 2, 3, 1? Is it 4, 2, 1, 3? Is it 2, 4, 1, 3? Or is it 2, 4, 3, 1? Now I will of course leave that up on the screen so you can take a proper look at that. But this is a pretty typical example of a question you might get because you're having to put in order the right processes as they occur. And of course the white wine production processes are slightly different to the red wine production processes, purely because we want to be able to extract some colour when it comes to red wine making. So in the case of white wine making, the correct order here is crushing, pressing, fermentation and then maturation. So that's 2, 4, 3, 1. Sticking on the theme of ensuring that we get the processes right and in the right order, this question is all about what would be last in the winemaking process. So would that be fermentation, crushing, bottling or maturation? Pretty simple example, I think, here, but again, it's just getting you familiar with that style of question and how the multiple choice questions for WSET Level 2 play out as you go through the exam. So the answer here is, of course, bottling. We can't be bottling our wine until we've done all those other stages. But let's have one more question here on assessment criteria part 2 and things that happen in the winery. So which of the following terms is the odd one out? Is it fermentation? Is it crushing? Is it pruning? Or is it pressing? So we've used some of those examples in previous questions. When we had the assessment criteria card up, you will have seen the key stages in the winemaking processes. And of course, one of these isn't associated with the winery, but it's associated with the vineyard. That's the odd one out here, and that is pruning, activity that takes place during the growing cycle in the vineyard. So with a few examples for assessment criteria number 2, let's move on to number 3. And that's where we're starting to describe how winemaking options are going to be influencing the style and quality of wine produced. And there is an awful lot to cover off here. And when you come onto the principal grape varieties as well, you'll start calling back to some of these key processes as well. So we're talking about things that might happen that are going to be winemaker-led, especially adjustments in the winery, things like the addition of sugar or adjustments to the acidity. The fermentation temperature and the options that the winemaker chooses, whether to do a cool fermentation or a warm fermentation. The processes of extraction for red wine, which can impart additional tannin and colour to the wine. Rosé wine and the short maceration, where the juice has contact with the skins for a defined amount of time, as well as blending, where we may blend our white wines and our red wines. For our sweet wines, we'll be covering off stopping the fermentation to retain some of the sugar, as well as adding additional sweetness. You're also going to be learning about the vessel types for maturation and what that can give to the winemaker in terms of options. So what does stainless steel bring to the wines? What would concrete bring to the wines? As well as oak maturation, and moving on here to what oak vessel types actually bring to the wine. So small barrels, large barrels, new oak versus old oak, and the level of toastiness that you might expect dependent upon the oak options that have been made by the wine producer. You're also going to cover off some specifics on what that brings to the wine, things like malolactic conversion and lees aging. And then finally, you're going to be looking at the blending of wines as well. And by this, we mean the blending of different grapes in wine. Think about something like a classic Bordeaux blend. You're blending Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot. Think about in the Northern Rhone, you might blend some Viognier with the Syrah. So you're going to start looking at the principal grapes as well as thinking about which grapes are blended together and why a winemaker might choose to do that. So let's go through a really classic example of a WSET Level 2 question. Now, on average, red wine is fermented at which temperature? Is it 20 to 32 degrees? Is it 15 to 27 degrees? Is it 12 to 20 degrees? Or is it 17 to 29 degrees? This really is a classic type of question. I think I got asked this one myself during my exam. And it's getting you familiar with the fact that red wines are fermented at different temperatures to white wines. And you'll learn that through the syllabus, through your courses. And red wines are invariably fermented at higher temperatures. And the correct answer here is actually the first one. It's 20 to 32 degrees. Now let's move on to a specific winemaking process, an option that the winemaker might choose to adopt in the winery. So chaptalization is used for what purpose? Is it to raise tannin, raise alcohol, raise sweetness, or raise acidity? Quite a technical term and a really good example of the type of question where your winemaking processes and what you've learnt about them helps you in an exam question like this one. Chaptalization is the addition of sugar to wine, and additional sugars are introduced to allow the winemaker to raise the alcohol content in that wine itself. So raise alcohol is the correct answer there. And I've got more winemaking associated terminology here for you with this next question. So punching down and pumping over are terms that are used for what purpose? Is it to extract additional colour, tannin and flavour? Is it to decrease the alcohol in the wine? Is it to extract the seeds or the stalks? Or is it to increase the acidity in the wine? Punching down and pumping over are two separate terms, but they both have the same aim when it comes to winemaking. If you think about someone literally punching down on the cap of the wine, it's to get those skins to fall to the bottom, to get those skins moving in about the wines. And we're really doing that for a couple of reasons. One is to extract more colour, another is to extract more tannin, to extract more flavour. And pumping over is a similar approach to doing that, exactly that, extracting more colour, tannin and flavour. You're taking the wines from the bottom of the vessel and you're pumping them back over the top. So you've got this constant mixing, if you like, of the skins with the juice that's going to extract all of those additional components. And finally, one further question here to give you an idea about what you might get asked. So what does lees aging add to a wine? Does it add red fruit aromas and flavours? Does it add creamy textures and savoury finishes? Does it add tropical aromas or does it add oaky aromas? The process of lees aging is to leave the dead yeast cells that have been used to ferment the wine from sugars into alcohols in the wine. You might stir them, you might leave them sat on the top of the juice. But they're there for a specific reason, and lots of winemakers use this particular process to create creamier textures and savoury finishes on the wines that they're creating. With some examples of assessment criteria, 3 covered off, let's move on to the final assessment criteria under this learning outcome. And that's number 4, it's being able to identify the key changes that occur to a wine during bottle aging. Now, in future videos, we're going to be covering off the principal grape varietals. And this is where you'll start to get a little bit of crossover between learning outcomes, because you'll be asked specific questions about aged varieties and what that might do to the wine. So you might start to get questions around aged Merlot, aged Cabernet Sauvignon. You might get asked about a wine from a specific region. You might get asked something along the lines of what sort of aromas and flavours would an aged Chateauneuf de Pape display? But for now, I've just come up with some basic examples, again, to get you familiar with that format and get you to thinking about the bottle aging processes and what that can do to a wine. So in this assessment criteria, for red wines, you're looking at the colour, tannin, aroma and flavour changes. And then for white wines, the colour, aroma and flavour changes. And so let's start off with a question about red wine. What colour could you expect an aged red wine to appear? Would it be purple, ruby, amber or tawny? And for me, this is a good example of a question you might get, because you will also, alongside learning this through the coursework, be tasting wines, and some of them are going to be young and some of them are going to be aged, and you're going to be documenting the systematic approach to tasting for a number of wines on your course that are going to get you familiar with what youthful versus aged looks like. In the case of a red wine, when it comes to the colours, we're going to be moving through the colours from purple through to tawny and on to garnet. So of these ones on the screen here, tawny is the colour you would expect an aged red wine to appear. And then I've also got a flavour associated question as well. So which of the following aromas could indicate an aged white wine? Would it be honey, lemon, green apple or grapefruit? And again, through the tasting processes that you're going to learn as part of this course, you're going to be tasting some youthful whites and finding out what they give you, as well as some aged whites as well. And I've deliberately put some youthful aroma characteristics in this one to give you an example of how the question might be structured. So as wines age, we are going to expect more honeyed aromas to come out than some of those younger citrus and green fruit types aromas. So honey would be the right answer here. That's everything I'm going to be covering off for part 2 today under learning outcome number 2. I hope you found this useful and the example questions giving you that little bit of guidance about what you're going to expect. Don't forget to check out the other videos in this series. We'll see you next time for part 3, but for now I'm going to say I'm the Grape Explorer. Cheers, see you soon.